Okay, so this should be the eighth and final lecture on the chapter of sexuality. Oh, fiddlesticks, let me get my timer. Chapter on sexuality and gender in psychology, or from the psychological perspective. The last lecture video we wrapped up and we were talking about, or I wrapped up discussing the some of the more common sexually transmitted infections. Yep, and pointed out that really about the only way to avoid them is what's to say, abstain, be faithful, and use a condom. I think there's a misspelling there. Okay, so this slide gets to the topic of disorders. Now, the thing about anything that we call a disordered, and we'll have a whole chapter on what we refer to as psychological disorder, is these are social constructs. In other words, these are things, these are ideas that our culture has decided that is not normal behavior, right? Or that is abnormal for the most part. So there's different ways you want to think about the whole, anything that is called a disorder is it a disorder? Why do we call it a disorder? Is it a disorder because society says that that's inappropriate behavior, or is it a disorder because it interferes with my ability to be a fully actualized human? So on one side of the list, you have some, and that's why the question mark is about, you have some list of some common, maybe a better word would probably be dysfunctions, when our body doesn't allow us to fully to get full pleasure out of our sexuality. On the other side of this list, you have some behaviors that begin to interfere with other people's physical comfort or with other people, right? So for instance, on the left side, where you have like hyperactive sexual desire, hypoactive sexual aversion disorder, some word I can't say, erectile dysfunction, male orgasmic disorder, premature ejaculation, female orgasmic disorder, and I can't say that one either. These are things that interfere with a person's with the way a person's body works, and in some cases they can cause pain, right? So like the one, which one, I think it's the one at the bottom. This is where so a woman could be like riding a bus and she might go into these like chronic orgasms are basically just spasms. They're muscle spasms of the uterus and the vagina cavity, and when periodically they feel good, but if they were to go on for a long time and you couldn't make them stop, that would be like any sort of muscle contraction. It causes pain. Right. What's another one here? Aversion, hyposexual desire, low desire. That could interfere with the relationship. That could be a part of you that you wishes wasn't there. So these are things that are potentially painful and can make it difficult for you to have, this a full sexual life. Whereas the list on the other side, but for instance, someone might not be bothered by having low desire, and somebody, one of them, I think it's male premature, no, is it male orgasmic disorder, where a man is unable to orgasm. I know a guy, or knew a guy, who didn't want to orgasm. He believed that was his life fluid and he never wanted to orgasm, right? So for him, that wouldn't be a problem. That's what I'm trying to say. Some people will see these as problems because it'll interfere with their life. Other people won't see them as problems because they don't interfere with their life. And that's the same thing when we'll talk about disorders at the end of the semester. It's sort of the same theme, right? On the other side, though, of these paraphilias, these are behaviors that begin to infringe upon other people. I guess not all of them are this way, but certainly like exhibitionism, right? Exhibitionism is when you get a thrill by exposing yourself, and that can make other people very uncomfortable. Or this I can't even say this, the forderism, and this is where you might like grab somebody in a public place, like you rub up against a stranger, on a bus or something like that, because you get a thrill off of that, or you might throw, like you touch someone in a way that they don't consent to. Fetishism probably doesn't fall under that category. Transvestite fetishism probably doesn't fall under that category. That would be what we talked about earlier in the chapter, and that's someone who gets a sexual a sexual pleasure by dressing in somebody else's clothes. Pedophilia would be considered highly taboo in our culture, and that's the violation of children. So that's where you're sexual, and that's codified. So that's considered a crime. We have some fairly rigid rules about sexuality in kids. Having said that, though, there are subgroups, there are subcultures where I think the group, I don't the group is called Children of God, and they believe that the way they get access to God that is through sex. And I don't know if it's like they have sex with their kids because they want their kids to experience God, or that because kids are more pure, so they have sex with children as a way. But that's all part of their religion, and I say that religion because I can't quite get my head around that one. Voyeurism would be considered sort of a violation of someone's privacy unless they gave you permission to watch. Sadism, right, causing pain, and then masochism, which is where you receive pain. Now, if these were in a consensual relationship, would that be considered a norm? I mean, does it interfere? So, but these are all, maybe it should say like sexual, I don't know, sexual variations or something. Okay, the last topic I want to talk about, and this one is really important to me, and I think that's because it's because I interact so much with young college age kids, is the topic of consent. And in another, I was thinking about trying to show it through the recorded, but that I'm having a hard time making that work. So I'm going to require that you watch a video as a requirement. So you have to take the quiz for this chapter, and you also have to watch the short little video where it uses the metaphor of consent as a cup of tea. And disclaimer, they use the F word, right? That is for mature audiences, that little video. But it's talking about, but the idea is that consent and what is meant by consent, right? And this cartoon, they sort of make the same argument, many of the same ones. Like, you might be okay with sex now, but you might change your mind an hour later, and that's completely acceptable to do so, right? That just because you agreed to sex on Monday doesn't mean you're agreeing to it on Friday. Or just because, what are some of the other ones, like a half an hour later? This one is like he takes his car and he says, I like Fluffy's new song in the middle of the night, or you wake people up in the middle of the night, right? Because you were okay with it before, doesn't mean you're okay with it now. And then I also invite you to think about a concept that was going around college campuses a few years ago called affirmative consent laws. And some universities have actually adopted affirmative consent laws. And what these are is these are laws that say that in order for consent to be given, consent is often like no means no, stop means stop, right? That was my parental lesson. I told both of my kids, no means no, stop means stop, right? But that's negative consent. That is basically saying, no, I don't want it. What affirmative consent says is that in order for consent is not to be assumed. Consent must be explicitly given, where it means you have to say yes. If you don't say yes, explicitly, yes, I want to do this with you, then you have not given consent, right? As opposed to just because I didn't say no, that means I gave consent. And that's what affirmative consent laws say. And then there's an argument, right? There's an argument, and this is what I ask you in a discussion post. What do you think of the argument? One says affirmative consent laws turns it into, normal human interactions into sexual offenses. And another one, what is the other one? Most people just aren't very talkative. So the idea that this isn't going to happen because people we're kind of uneasy. But this gets back to adult relationships, adult expectations, adult level of communication, right? And this is all in response to the abundance of sexual assaults on college campuses. On college campuses, I guess when people were together, who knows what it's going to look like after the pandemic. But there's a couple of concepts called red zones. And red zones are times of the year and places where it is particularly dangerous for particularly high risk of sexual assault. And these are the beginning of the semester, right? The beginning of every fall, and fraternity houses. And these are places where they have big parties. You don't necessarily know anyone. You go to make friends, but you may not know your way around. You may not know, you may be uneasy with boundaries. You may not know the culture. So we're not necessarily at our most vigilant, right? Gray rape is the term given to someone has been involved in a sexual encounter. Um, they don't think of it necessarily as assault, but they did ask them to stop and they didn't stop. They must have been more assertive. And what we talk about in college life is, no means no, stop means stop. If you ask them to stop and they didn't, that is assault. We call it gray rape because a person may not perceive it as what it is. They may be reluctant because it's embarrassing, because it's shameful, because they don't want to think that their friend or this person would have raped them. But by definition, that would meet the definition, right? Okay, so that is my little soapbox, my little PSA. No means no, stop means stop, period. Check it out. Consent. Consent is like a cup of tea. I'm going to stop right there. This wraps up the last of this chapter.